Frazetta Friday. I'm Sarah, and I'd like to welcome you all back to another episode of Frazetta Fridays with Frazetta Girls. Tonight's episode is part 2 of our look at my grandfather, Frank Frazetta's many paintings and drawings illustrating the fiction of Edgar Rice Burroughs. I had mentioned in part 1 that my grandpa grew up loving the Tarzan Sunday strip drawn by Hal Foster, as well as J. Allen St. John's illustrations for the Burroughs stories that were being published in pulp magazines and hardback books. Frazetta's teenage sketchbooks are full of drawings inspired by Burroughs' fiction, featuring cavemen, jungle maidens, apes, and big cats, and one of his first professional comic stories featured Judy of the Jungle, a sort of female Tarzan imitation that was published in 1948 by Netter Comics. And you'll recall that Grandpa's Thunder #1 comic in 1952 was also heavily influenced by ERB. As described in part 1, after leaving Al Cap's studio, Frank was commissioned to illustrate the Canaveral Press editions of Tarzan at the Earth's Core, Tarzan and the Castaways, and several other books in 1962. Around this time, his friend Roy Krenkel had been contacted by Donald Wollheim, the editor of Ace Books, to paint covers for their line of Burroughs paperback reprints. As a longtime Burroughs reader and fan, Roy quickly agreed and just as quickly began to regret his decision. Though he would frequently say otherwise, Krenkel was an absolutely wonderful artist. After serving in the Army in MacArthur's Return to the Philippines campaign during World War II, Roy took classes at the Art Students League, the Cooper Union, and at the Byrne Hogarth's Cartoonist and Illustrator School. He learned how to paint and paint very well, but always questioned his own abilities, especially when compared to the work of his younger friends. Roy was a funny, eccentric, extremely knowledgeable character who would routinely put down his own work while taking other artists under his wing to encourage and advise, including Al Williamson, Jeff Jones, Bernie Wrightson, Michael Kaluta, and of course, Frank Frazetta. For a generation of readers, J. Allen St. John's art was the standard for illustrating the works of Edgar Rice Burroughs, but St. John had passed away in 1957, and in 1962, Wollheim wanted Krenkel's covers for Ace to have the St. John look. As soon as he began, Roy began to doubt what he was doing. Roy said, "I did the first few covers by myself, then somewhere down the line, maybe the 4th one if memory serves, I dragged Frank in to help me with the difficult areas, not so much with the idea but with the painting, which Frank could do and I couldn't do. When he would help me, Frank's problem was to try to make it look like mine. It was very difficult for him to attempt to confine himself to my rigid, dull style at the time. Frank would paint the hair and work out how lighting would go across the face or the hand. He picked up the colors, little details, highlights. He just knew how to pop it. When I would go to an area I was unsure of and didn't want to kill the thing at that point, I'd say, 'You better take it, Frank.' I didn't know, for instance, how an eye would go down when the head was tipped down. I couldn't figure out where it would be dark and where it would be light, and Frank knew all of this. He had great control, which I didn't have." 2 of the covers that Krenkel specifically mentioned that were, in his opinion, saved by Frazetta were Tarzan Triumphant and Back to the Stone Age. Just as he had done when he was commissioned by the Canaveral Press to illustrate The Cave Girl, Roy began encouraging Ace to hire Frazetta too, but because of his background in comics, Wollheim was skeptical that Frazetta could paint paperback covers. Krenkel, however, wouldn't take no for an answer and brought up Frazetta's name every time he delivered a painting. Frazetta remembered, "Roy finally brought me to Wollheim and said, 'He's the guy that can do it,' and he was more than reluctant to give me a shot. I showed him copies of the Canaveral drawings and some of my early paintings, including Golden Girl and my Big Lion painting, and he said, 'Interesting, but can you do Tarzan? Can I do Tarzan?' So I went home and painted Tarzan and the Ant-Men as a sample. When I showed him, he said, 'Well, okay.' He finally gave me a cover to do, which was Tarzan and the Lost Empire. That's the first paperback cover I did, and it wasn't really good. I think it's actually pretty terrible. It's very Foster-ish, done in watercolor, and I was running scared, not sure of myself anymore, and Ace really didn't give me any of that confidence I needed." Though he didn't think much of the first cover, readers had a very different reaction. They absolutely loved it. Copies of Tarzan and the Lost Empire began flying off the paperback racks, and letters praising Frazetta and demanding more began arriving at the Ace offices. Donald Wollheim, though a bit perplexed, recognized a good thing when he had it and quickly assigned Grandpa to do more covers. But that didn't exactly make him happy either. In a 1978 interview, Frazetta remembered, They didn't seem to like me and didn't take me seriously. Their reaction to a painting was more like a snicker than an approval. I'm a very proud guy and I'm very sensitive too. I just didn't like the treatment I got. Because of that, plus the fact that they kept my original artwork and they paid very little money, it made me very bitter to say the least. I refused to go out on a limb and give them a really superior piece of work and put my heart into it. Honestly, I was a bit of revising his past because Grandpa most definitely created some paintings for those first Ace covers that he most certainly did put his heart into, and it showed. Working in either watercolor or oils, and occasionally a little bit of both, most of his paintings for Ace were fairly modest in size, often something around 9 by 11 inches. Part of the commission, he was also required to provide an ink drawing for the title page, most of which were around 4 or 5 inches tall. Frazetta was paid between $250 and $300 per job, about $3,000 in today's dollars, for which, as he mentioned, he had to give up his originals. So yes, considering the pay and his treatment, there were a few covers that he probably bashed out without much thought, and he once painted 3 in 2 days: Jungle Tales of Tarzan, Tarzan and the Lion Man, and Tarzan and the City of Gold. He said, "I wasn't even working on them full time. I was doing other stuff over those 2 days too. All 3 are bad, but what the hell? You just don't do 3 paintings on a weekend." Frazetta, who never had a deadline that he wouldn't push, tried to dry his oil painting for Tarzan at the Earth's Core in the oven, but he had turned the heat up too high and was alarmed as he watched, in his words, the goddamn board started to warp right in front of my eyes. The board started to bend into a half moon shape. I tried to straighten it out and it snapped in half. It was such a simple painting that it was easier for me to repaint it than try to fix it, which Frazetta quickly did, and he gave the damaged art to his friend and well-known Burroughs fan, Vern Coryell. Some years later, collector Robert R. Barrett acquired and carefully repaired the painting. Over time, it changed hands and was owned by several other collectors. It eventually sold at auction in 2015 for $66,000. I suspect it would sell for a lot more today. But there were other covers that my grandfather took care in creating and was extremely proud of, including Carson of Venus, which Krenkel was successful in convincing Wollheim to return to Frazetta as a goodwill gesture. Tarzan the Invincible, The Son of Tarzan, The Lost Continent, a watercolor which he repainted in oils for himself several decades later, Savage Pellucidar, Beyond the Farthest Star, and especially Tarzan and the Jewels of Opar and the Mad King. Of Tarzan and the Jewels of Opar, Frank said, "A little jewel. I loved it, and you can't imagine how I hated to turn that one in." And I had the opportunity to see the original recently at a Burroughs exhibit hosted by the Society of Illustrators in New York a few years ago, and I wholeheartedly agree with my grandfather. It really is a little jewel. When it comes to the Mad King, well, there's a story there. Frazetta was very pleased with the way that the painting had turned out and really wanted to keep it. So following publication, he asked if he could briefly borrow the art back so he could have photographed it for his portfolio. Promising to return it within a few days, Ace agreed and loaned him the art. Frank returned home and promptly painted a copy, dried it in the oven, slowly this time, and then returned the copy to Ace and kept the first version for himself. Despite the copy being a bit rougher in finish with a few minor differences from the original, the publisher apparently never caught on. All in all, I think Grandpa produced something like 18 covers plus title page drawings for the first incredibly successful series of Burroughs paperbacks from Ace. He also painted covers for books by other authors from them as well. Ace sold or gave away all his originals, and where they've wound up over the years is anyone's guess. Occasionally a piece will turn up at auction, but most haven't been seen for nearly 60 years. And with fires and natural disasters, it's impossible to know how many of those artworks still exist. I hope they all do. Lancer Books, Dell, Ballantine, and others took notice of the clamor over Frazetta's Burroughs covers, offered him more money to work for them, and agreed that he would keep his originals. So it wasn't a surprise that my grandfather happily parted company with Ace, at least for a while. Regardless of Grandpa's feelings and the publisher's pay and policies, Ace really did help establish his illustration career. Wollheim might not have been a huge fan of his art, but he was unquestionably an important editor in the fantasy and science fiction field, and he did give him a lot of work when he needed it most. Wollheim left Ace in 1971 and formed Daw Books with his wife Elsie in 1972. Daw became a success successful publisher discovered many popular writers, including Robert Jordan, Tanith Lee, and C.J. Cherryh, and featured wonderful covers by Tim Kirk and Roy Krenkel, among others. But Frazetta, though asked, had a bit of a grudge against Wollheim and would not work for Daw. But Grandpa wasn't finished with Edgar Rice Burroughs when he stopped working for Ace. He drew the covers for two of his mysteries, The Girl from Ferris's and The Efficiency Expert, for the amateur press The House of Greystroke in 1965 and 1966, respectively. And for the back cover of the October 1966 issue of Mad Magazine, he painted a 4-panel Tarzan parody, Early One Morning in the Jungle. Then in late 1969, Frazetta was approached by Carl Herman, the art director at Doubleday, with the commission to paint the cover for the Science Fiction Book Club's edition of the novel Downward to Earth by Robert Silverberg. Not only was it the beginning of a profitable relationship with the publisher, but it also earned Frank his first recognition from his peers with an award of excellence from the Society of Illustrators, and it directly led to his creating more art based on the work of Edgar Rice Burroughs. The book club had acquired the rights to publish the John Carter of Mars novels, and Herman, remembering Frazetta's work for Ace, hired him to paint the cover and draw interior illustrations for A Princess of Mars in 1970. Since Frazetta was never much of a reader, Herman gave him image suggestions and provided highlighted text passages for descriptions. The pay was great, and of course he got to keep his originals, and he was pretty happy about that. A Princess of Mars was an instant hit, and the cover featuring John Carter with an upraised sword and a sexy Dejah Thoris by his side became iconic. It was followed by 4 equally popular illustrated editions: The God of Mars and Warlord of Mars in 1971, Thuvia Maid of Mars and the Chessman of Mars in 1972, The Mastermind of Mars and Fighting Man of Mars in 1973, and Sword of Mars and Synthetic Men of Mars in 1974. Frazetta's cover paintings were some of his best, even if he ignored Burroughs' description of the heroines Dejah Thoris and Thuvia as having reddish copper skin, but his first ink illustrations were fairly sketchy and loose. However, with each book, he started actually having fun with the assignments, and he began producing the tighter, more finished art. My grandmother Ellie often said that some of those later drawings were among her favorites of my grandfather's work. Frazetta produced covers for a number of other books for the book club during this time too, including Orn by Piers Anthony, Dancer from Atlantis by Poole Anderson, and Flashing Swords 1 and 2 edited by Lynn Carter, among others. All of the titles with Frazetta's covers were used as lures to attract new members to the book club. For many years, they were featured prominently in ads that let people choose 5 books for $1 when they joined. He also created promotional art for the Science Fiction Book Club, for Spurs, the Western Writers of America Book Club, and for the Mystery Guild Book Club as well. Unfortunately, nothing lasts forever. When the art director censored one of Frank's illustrations for Synthetic Men of Mars without telling him, covering the woman's breasts and her buttocks with a skirt, well, my grandfather quit, and he refused to illustrate their final book in the series, Alana of Gothel and John Carter of Mars. Richard Corbin was hired to provide the art, and the collection of the 4 stories was finally published in 1977. Nevertheless, the book club editions illustrated by Frank proved to be so incredibly popular with readers that they simultaneously opened yet another door of opportunity for Frazetta. Charles Volpe, the new art director for his old client Ace Books, took notice of A Princess of Mars and The God of Mars and offered him the commission to paint the covers of their line of Burroughs paperback reprints. With Wollheim gone, the promise of higher pay, and of course the condition that he would retain ownership of his originals, Frazetta accepted the commission. He proceeded to create around 20 paintings between 1972 and 1974, and Ace reused several of his covers from the 1960s as well. Though they technically still owned publication rights to them, Volpe paid him a reprint fee for their use to compensate for Frank's treatment in the 1960s. As a result, my grandfather enthusiastically produced an exciting series of paintings. Fans were thrilled, sales were great, and his cover for Back to the Stone Age, featuring a warrior facing down a rampaging mammoth, earned Frazetta his 2nd award of excellence from the Society of Illustrators. His 1972 cover painting for Escape on Venus sold at auction for $666,000, while his 1974 cover for At the Earth's Core sold for $1,075,500 in 2016. However, Grandpa wasn't entirely happy with the republished versions of several of his published covers. Rather than doing new paintings, he thoroughly revised The Moon Maid, which became incredibly popular with fans, and completely changed his cover for the Edgar Rice Burroughs Master of Adventure into The Moon's Rapture, which replaced Tarzan with a nude woman. Many people really like The Moon's Rapture, but there are also others who ask where the light illuminating the woman's backside is coming from. As his friend Nick Meglin said, impossible lighting was always one of Frank's trademarks, but he probably should have named that painting Two Moons. My grandfather continued to draw various Burroughs characters later in life and actually completed several illustrations for a proposed edition of Tarzan of the Apes before the project was canceled. He would say that he only drew Dejah Thoris or Tarzan to sell to collectors, but I believe he always got a lot of pleasure out of doing them too. In a way, each drawing was a walk down memory lane for him, back to his boyhood when he was laying on his living room floor, excitedly reading Hal Foster's Sunday Page, back to the days when he was climbing trees and competing with his friends to be Tarzan of the Month. Well, that's all for this one. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and share with a Frazetta fan. But before you go, in case you missed it, we do have an exciting announcement. We will be releasing John Carter of Mars, the first 1/12 scale action figure from our Icon Collectibles before the end of the year. I'm Sarah, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time for Frazetta Fridays.